The airfield at Clark, on a hot afternoon in 1943, shimmered under the Pacific sun. The war had already dragged across 2 brutal years, 2 years of endless smoke, loss, and the echo of engines that never seemed to rest. A group of American airmen stood gathered near the far edge of the tarmac, squinting through the glare at a strange bird that had landed days ago under heavy guard. Its once green paint was scarred and faded, riddled with bullet holes. Its propellers sat still, its engine silent, as if the machine itself was ashamed to be there. It was a Japanese bomber, sleek, slender, and unmistakably foreign. Painted along the fuselage was the faint trace of a red circle, the rising sun insignia. The U.S. ground crew had spent the last 48 hours combing over every inch of it, taking notes, sketching diagrams, and whispering in disbelief. This was no ordinary wreck. It was a fully captured Mitsubishi G4M, the aircraft Allied pilots had come to fear and mock in equal measure. The Americans called it the Betty. One mechanic leaned inside through the torn fuselage, his flashlight sweeping across the empty interior. "Can you believe this?" he muttered. "No armor plates. No protection around the tanks." He tapped the thin skin of the plane's belly with a wrench. The sound was hollow, fragile, like striking a tin can. Outside, another pilot shook his head, his voice low. "No self-sealing tanks either. It's a flying torch." And yet, for all its fragility, the Betty had carved a terrifying reputation. It was fast, long-ranged, and carried torpedoes capable of sinking battleships. It was the same aircraft that had delivered Admiral Yamamoto across the Pacific, and the same that had gone down in a fireball when American P-38s intercepted his convoy. As the U.S. engineers studied its slender frame, one question echoed louder than the rest. Why would Japan build a bomber this vulnerable, and send its crews to certain death? To understand that, they would have to look back to the roots of Japanese air doctrine, and the mindset that shaped the Imperial Navy's most dangerous yet most fragile weapon. When Japan entered the war, it brought with it an aviation philosophy unlike any other power. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, speed and range were everything. Every ounce of weight was an enemy, every layer of armor a thief of performance. The G4M Betty had been designed in the late 1930s to be the sharp spear of Japanese naval air power, capable of striking American fleets from beyond the horizon, before they even saw the attack coming. It was a revolutionary concept. At the time, Western bombers were built heavy, armored, compartmented, and layered with redundancy. The Americans had their B-17 Flying Fortress, a name that said it all. The Japanese, in contrast, wanted an aircraft that could move like a sword, not a shield. When Mitsubishi engineer Kiro Honjo and his design team received their orders in 1937, the Imperial Navy gave them a seemingly impossible requirement: a twin-engine bomber that could fly more than 3,000 miles, carry a torpedo, and cruise at fighter-like speed. That meant one thing: every ounce had to count. The team stripped everything that wasn't absolutely essential. They used ultra-thin aluminum skin, a lightweight structure, and the bare minimum of internal protection. Even the landing gear was pared down for weight. And most fatally, they omitted self-sealing fuel tanks, the very thing that could have saved hundreds of Japanese crews later on. It wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated risk, a belief that Japan could win through range and speed alone. In the early months of the Pacific War, that gamble seemed to pay off. When Japanese Bettys roared over the skies of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies in 1941 and 1942, they struck with terrifying precision. Allied ships and bases, unprepared for such reach, were pounded into submission. The Betty's ability to deliver Type 91 torpedoes at low altitude made it one of the deadliest naval bombers in the world. American and British pilots learned to fear its silhouette, long wings, twin engines, and the distinctive rounded glass nose that glinted in the sun before the first explosions hit. But that fear didn't last forever. By mid-1942, as Allied fighters gained experience and new aircraft began to fill the skies, the Betty's weaknesses became impossible to ignore. It burned. Every time a tracer round or a .50 caliber bullet found its mark, the fuel tanks ignited in a flash that engulfed the plane. It wasn't just an accident, it was physics. The Betty's massive 1,000-gallon fuel load sat right between the wings, unprotected, waiting for a spark. Crews soon called it the one-shot lighter. By Guadalcanal, The air over the Solomon Islands became a graveyard for these bombers. American F-4F Wildcats and later F-6F Hellcats tore into them in brutal dogfights. Even when a Betty managed to escape, the odds were grim. Pilots often ditched far from base, their aircraft smoking, their gunners dead. And yet, Japan kept flying them. To the Imperial Navy, the G4M wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of offensive spirit. Pilots were taught that armor was unnecessary, even cowardly. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, ran through the air arm as deeply as it did through the infantry. Survival wasn't the goal, victory was. When captured Betty wrecks began washing up on Allied-controlled islands, American engineers could hardly believe what they saw. They were used to aircraft built like tanks, machines that could limp home with half their fuselage missing. The Betty was the opposite, efficient, elegant, and fatally fragile. At the heart of it all was a cultural difference, one that defined much of Japan's early war success and its eventual downfall. The Americans didn't know it yet, but they were staring at the physical embodiment of Japan's wartime philosophy, one that valued reach and sacrifice over protection and endurance. And in the jungles and hangars of the Pacific, those lessons would soon turn into fire and tragedy on a massive scale. The smell of scorched aluminum hung over Rabaul like a constant memory. The Japanese base, once the beating heart of their Pacific operations, was a hive of activity, crowded with Betty bombers lined wingtip to wingtip. Mechanics worked under the glare of the equatorial sun, fueling, rearming, patching bullet holes with makeshift aluminum sheets scavenged from wrecks. Every dawn, crews climbed into those fragile fuselages, knowing each flight might be their last. The men who flew the G4M weren't naive. They knew their bombers' weaknesses better than anyone. The fuel tanks beneath their feet were a death sentence waiting to ignite. They watched comrades vanish in orange blossoms of flame hundreds of times. Yet they still volunteered. To them, the Betty was a weapon of destiny. Its long range and light frame weren't flaws, they were the reason Japan could strike far, deep, and unexpectedly. One pilot, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, would later become a legend. During the Battle of Midway, his G4M took damage early in the assault. Fuel leaked from a ruptured tank, trailing vapor behind his formation. He knew it wouldn't make it back to base. But he pressed on, leading his torpedo squadron in a suicidal attack against the American fleet. His plane never returned. His sacrifice became part of the myth, the belief that the pilot's spirit was the armor the aircraft lacked. For Japanese engineers and commanders, those sacrifices were not just tragic, they were proof that their doctrine worked. The Betty was never meant to bring its crew home safely. It was meant to strike fear, deliver destruction, and die gloriously if needed. Meanwhile, the Americans, from intelligence officers to factory engineers, saw something very different. To them, the G4M was an engineering paradox. How could such a beautiful design be so fatally flawed? In a captured hangar at Bougainville, U.S. analysts mapped out its structure on chalkboards, tracing the flow of fuel lines, the lack of armor plating around the cockpit, the minimal protection for the gunners. The more they studied it, the more it defied logic. The self-sealing fuel tank, a basic safety feature in every American bomber since the late 1930s, was completely absent. One engineer compared it to a cigarette soaked in gasoline. He wasn't exaggerating. The Betty's fuel tanks were simple aluminum bladders directly exposed to the fuselage walls. In combat, even one tracer round could puncture a line, and the resulting explosion often tore the aircraft in half. But what the Americans missed at first was why the Japanese had made that choice. The Pacific was a theater of vast distances. Bases were scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan's naval air service needed aircraft that could reach targets far beyond what Western bombers could attempt. The only way to achieve that was to shave off every unnecessary pound, armor, redundant systems, and, tragically, protection. In Japan's pre-war mindset, the pilot was expected to compensate for what the machine lacked. He was supposed to be faster, braver, more disciplined. To die for the emperor was not defeat, it was honor. That belief ran so deep that even as reports piled up of Betty crews burning alive, the design philosophy barely changed. By late 1942, the air war over the Solomon Islands became a relentless slaughter. The Betty's long range allowed it to reach Allied convoys and Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, but each mission was a coin toss with fate. American radar and fighters now owned the daylight skies. Squadrons of P-38 Lightnings and F-4U Corsairs intercepted the Japanese bombers miles before they reached their targets. From the ground, Marines would watch contrails spiraling down, one after another, fireballs plunging into the sea. Some pilots survived long enough to see the flames creep along the wings before the aircraft exploded midair. Still, the Betty's precision and reach remained unmatched in one key role: maritime strike. It was the only bomber in the Japanese arsenal capable of carrying the deadly Type 91 torpedo over oceanic distances. The aircraft's slim design allowed it to skim just above the waterline at incredible speed, releasing its payload with terrifying accuracy. That made it indispensable to Japan's naval operations, especially during the early Pacific campaigns. But as the tide of war shifted, those same missions turned suicidal. By 1943, the Allies had improved radar coverage, better anti-aircraft guns, and fighter escorts that could outrun and outgun anything Japan could send. The skies that had once been the Betty's hunting ground became its graveyard. And yet, perhaps the most infamous moment in the aircraft's history came not in victory, but in tragedy, when it carried Japan's most revered naval commander into an ambush that would change the course of the Pacific War. On April 18, 1943, two G4M Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul, carrying Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had planned a morale-boosting inspection tour of frontline bases. Japanese code clerks had sent his itinerary through encrypted channels, but the Americans had already broken the code. Operation Vengeance was set in motion. A squadron of P-38 Lightnings took off from Guadalcanal, flying a daring, low-level interception mission across 400 miles of ocean. Their target, the Betty carrying Yamamoto. The Japanese formation flew at 6,500 feet, cruising steady and unaware. In the lead plane, Yamamoto sat calmly, unaware that death was minutes away. At 9:34 a.m., the American fighters made visual contact. The Lightnings climbed silently beneath the clouds, their engines throttled low. In seconds, tracers erupted across the sky. The escorting Zero fighters peeled off to engage, but it was too late. One P-38 locked onto Yamamoto's Betty and fired a long burst from its nose guns. The Betty caught fire instantly. Witnesses from the second bomber saw it roll violently, its right wing shearing away. Moments later, it plunged into the jungle canopy below, a single column of black smoke rising into the morning sky. When Japanese search teams found the wreck hours later, Yamamoto's body was still seated in his chair, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. That moment crystallized everything about the Betty's design. It could carry Japan's most powerful leaders across impossible distances, but it couldn't protect them when the bullets came. For the Americans who later examined the wreckage, the lesson was stark. The very thing that made the Betty a masterpiece of range and efficiency was also what doomed it. In the months that followed, U.S. intelligence officers collected every report they could on the aircraft, comparing combat outcomes, engineering diagrams, and captured parts. Their conclusion was unanimous: Japan had built a bomber optimized for offense, not survival. And in modern warfare, that was a fatal miscalculation. The Betty was not simply a machine, it was a mirror reflecting Japan's military soul. Fast, daring, uncompromising, and ultimately consumed by its own fire. As the summer of 1943 turned to fall, the G4M continued to fly, though fewer and fewer returned. The men who built and flew them watched the Empire's airpower burn away, one unarmored plane at a time. Yet even then, Japan refused to abandon its doctrine. The Betty remained in production, retooled for new missions, some that would take its already suicidal nature to terrifying new extremes. By 1944, Japan's once proud skies were fading into silence. Allied bombers darkened the horizon daily, and the defensive perimeter that once stretched across the Pacific was collapsing island by island. Rabaul, Truk, Saipan, each base that had once launched fleets of Betty bombers now lay in ruins. Those that remained were scarred, pitted with craters, and littered with twisted wrecks that had once borne the red sun. The G4M, despite its flaws, refused to disappear. Even as newer aircraft like the Ki-67 Hiryu began to enter service, the Betty remained the workhorse of Japan's exhausted air arm. It was fast to build, easy to maintain, and still capable of carrying heavy payloads across the vast Pacific distances that defined the Empire's last hope. But the skies had changed. The American air umbrella was absolute. P-38s, Hellcats, and Mustangs prowled every route, and the radar network now spotted any formation long before it neared its target. For Betty Cruz, every mission had become a one-way journey. And yet, in the desperate logic of late 1944, that very vulnerability became a kind of dark advantage. If a bomber was doomed to burn anyway, why not turn it into a weapon of deliberate sacrifice? The Betty became one of the first platforms repurposed for TACO, special attack missions, what the West would come to call kamikaze. Cruz stripped out defensive guns and replaced them with massive payloads of explosives. In one notorious experiment, engineers even fitted a Betty to carry an Oka, a rocket-powered human-guided bomb slung beneath its belly like a parasite. The plan was chillingly simple. The Betty would carry the Oka within range of the American fleet, release it, and watch as the pilot-guided missile dove into a ship. The Bettys tasked with this duty were marked as dead before takeoff. Their heavy loads and slow speeds made them easy targets, and American fighters learned quickly to intercept them long before they reached striking distance. Entire squadrons vanished, consumed in midair infernos before their weapons could even be released. For those who watched from below, whether American sailors scanning the skies or Japanese ground crews seeing their comrades disappear into the horizon, it was the same haunting sight, the same slim fuselage, the same beautiful, doomed shape, flying toward death as if it were destiny. In those final months, the Betty symbolized the collapse of an empire's dreams and doctrines. It had started as a machine of reach and precision, a symbol of technological ambition. It ended as a weapon of desperation, stripped of everything but purpose. When American forces finally captured the remains of Japan's airfields in 1945, they found Bettys scattered like ghosts across the runways, some riddled with bullet holes, others burned down to their frames. Many had never even taken off. Their pilots had no fuel, no hope, and no reason to believe they could make a difference anymore. And yet, the story didn't end there. In hangars and intelligence depots across the Pacific, Allied engineers continued to study the Betty long after the war was over. They weren't just fascinated by its flaws, they were captivated by its vision. For all its fragility, it had achieved something few aircraft could match: extraordinary range and efficiency. In fact, some of the lessons drawn from the Betty's design would later influence post-war aviation thinking. The understanding of lightweight structures, aerodynamic efficiency, and long-range optimization found echoes in peacetime aircraft, but always balanced with the lessons of survivability that Japan had ignored. For the Japanese engineers who survived, the war's end was a reckoning. Men like Kiro Honjo looked upon the ashes of their creation and saw both pride and regret. The Betty had done what it was designed to do. It had carried Japan's hopes farther than anyone thought possible. But it had also carried thousands of young men to their deaths. In memoirs written decades later, one former designer reflected quietly, "We built a bird that could soar beyond any horizon. We forgot that wings also need protection." That was the paradox of the Betty. It was a masterpiece of range and simplicity, but a disaster of survivability. It could strike farther than any bomber of its time, yet it could not withstand even a single well-placed burst. It symbolized Japan's entire war in microcosm: audacious, innovative, and ultimately self-destructive. When American occupation forces finally scrapped the last surviving Bettys, they left behind only fragments, twisted aluminum, faded Hinomaru insignia, and the faint scent of burned fuel still clinging to the ground. But for those who had seen it, for the pilots who had fought against it, and for the men who had flown it, the image would never fade. Even decades later, veterans could recall the sight of those green silhouettes crossing the sun, their engines humming in perfect symmetry, until tracers reached them, and the sky erupted into fire. For the Americans who examined the captured Bettys, the memory of that fragile machine was a lesson written in flame. They had laughed, at first, at its paper-thin armor and unprotected tanks. But when they understood the purpose behind it, the belief, the doctrine, the culture that had shaped it, the laughter gave way to something else, a kind of quiet respect. Because in the end, Betty was more than just an airplane. It was the embodiment of a nation's will to reach beyond its limits, even at the cost of everything. The engineers who designed it believed speed could replace safety. The pilots who flew it believed courage could replace armor. And together, they forged a machine that was both magnificent and doomed, a flying contradiction of beauty and tragedy. When American mechanics first touched the torn fuselage of a captured Betty in 1943, they couldn't understand why it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. 2 years later, they understood all too well. The Betty wasn't built to survive war. It was built to define it.